I see we're supposed to be talking about the 20th century. My students at Fordham would consider that ancient history. But I teach a course on Islamic political thought, and they said, when are we going to get to 2001? And I said, in another course, actually. I think we're going to stop around 1914. I'd like to talk a little bit about something that goes back in history quite a bit, and it's Auricular Confession, but then bring it up to the 21st century, in fact, 2 years ago in Ireland. What exactly is Auricular Confession, the practice that was at the center of People versus Phillips? It's the usual expression of the sacrament of reconciliation or penance in the Catholic tradition over many centuries. Jesus forgave sinners with a liberality that scandalized his contemporaries. Some of those he forgave, like the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8, were people whose sins were well known. But there were others whose misdeeds Jesus seems to have intuited, like the handicapped man lowered in his litter through the roof of a house in Capernaum in Mark chapter 2. John's Gospel tells us that the risen Jesus commissioned his disciples to forgive as he had forgiven. If you forgive the sins of any, Jesus says, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. Forgiving and retaining may have been two aspects of the same action, unleashing people from their sins and binding them to a new life. The early church, I will not talk about the Greek church, which has a different history on this. The early church in the Latin-speaking West was less liberal with forgiveness than was Jesus. The Church of North Africa, in particular, knew rigorists as early as the 3rd century of the Common Era, who wanted to recognize no more than one chance after baptism, at most, for what was called penitentia secunda, second penance, with baptism itself considered to be first penance. No third penance was tolerated, and we can see that in a document even of the 2nd century, the Shepherd of Hermas. Some North African rigorists wanted those who had committed serious sins, and especially apostasy in a time of persecution, a not infrequent phenomenon, either to be rebaptized or to be cut off completely from the church. The broader church rejected such rigorism at the Council of Nicaea in 325 of the Common Era. That rigorism continued to pop up in North Africa until the 5th century, the time of Augustine. And in some ways, I maintain, it returned to the same geographical area with the Kharijite tradition of Islam in the 8th century. Penance was more public in the first half of the first millennium in the Latin Church, and generally only employed for reconciling notorious apostates who had repented, as well as adulterers and murderers. Penitents entered into what they call the order of penitence, and remained there for some time, sometimes years, engaging in works of charity, prayer, and fasting, until the bishop was satisfied that they had done sufficient penance, and then they would be absolved, finally unleashed from both sin and penance. The whole community, led by the bishop, would be involved in the ritual conclusion of one's period as a penitent, but there were great regional differences as to the form of such a ritual. In many places, it was associated with the Liturgy of Holy Thursday, when the penitents would be reintroduced to the Eucharist. The more elaborate the liturgy, the less likely it was to be offered more than once to any particular sinner in his or her lifetime after baptism. This led to the delay of one's baptism or of one's post-baptismal second penance to one's deathbed. With Christianity triumphant in the Roman Empire and its successor states, the season of Lent evolved from a time of joyful preparation for adult baptism to being a season of somewhat mournful repentance for sin. In the furthermost Christian West, Ireland and the areas of Western Europe evangelized from Ireland, individual penitential practices developed in the early part of the second half of the first millennium of the Common Era. Monks and nuns in the Celtic West offered their services as what was called a soul friend, an amcara in Irish. Spiritual confidants and advisors, who might also de facto serve as a source of absolution from sin, formal or informal, as well as reconciliation with the Church as a whole, thus replacing the bishops of an earlier era. But the evidence for the absolution of sin by an anam cara, a soul friend, is a bit cloudy. The soul friend, somewhat like the murshid in Islamic mysticism, could impose penitential practices on those who sought their services. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, thinking that he was dying of his wounds on the battlements of Pamplona in May of 1521, confessed his sins to a fellow soldier, who was his soul friend in time of need. For some people, especially here in New York City, bartenders serve in the same capacity. The individualization of the sacrament of reconciliation and the growth of penitential pilgrimage sites like St. Patrick's Purgatory in Lough Derg in Ireland went hand in hand. Your soul friend, your anam cara, your father confessor or mother confessor, as the case might be, would assign you this or that penitential practice. To the present day, the pilgrims to Lough Derg are urged to use the opportunity there for confession, as well as to fast, pray, and walk around barefoot on all those stone-filled prayer beds, going sleepless for a night. Colm Tóibín started out all right 2 decades or so ago on such pilgrimage, but got fed up after a while and slipped away. Meanwhile, penances became less rigorous than they had been earlier, as more stress was laid on the complete admission of sins and absolution. The Irish writer Sean O'Faolain, while visiting Rome in 1948, returned to Catholic practice after 26 years' absence, derived from the bitterness caused by the Irish bishop's 1922 excommunication of the Republicans in the Civil War. O'Faolain expected that his long absence would attract a dramatic penance, like a pilgrimage, or at least something more spectacular than what he got, 3 Hail Marys. Disgruntled at first, it suddenly dawned on him that he had been properly put in his place. Celtic penitential practice spread to mainland Europe in the 7th century. Priests in religious orders, not only monks, are called father, padre, père, herr pater, etc., because they often serve as father confessors. The diocesan clergy are given different titles: don, Monsieur le Curé, Monsieur l'Abbé, Herr Pfarrer. Cardinal Henry Manning in 19th century England began the custom of having all Catholic priests called father in English. It does not go back any earlier than that, and you can see in the text of William Sampson, at one point, Father Coleman is referred to as the Mr. Coleman. In fact, it was incorrect because he was a religious and should have been called Father Coleman, as he was in the dramatization last night. The reforms of the Fourth Council of the Lateran in 1215 brought the sacrament of penance or reconciliation more or less to its current form, with less emphasis on dramatic acts of penance like pilgrimages and fasts, and more on the full confession of one's sins and the reception of absolution. Martin Luther criticized the Catholic tradition of full acknowledgement of one's serious sins, rather than a more general declaration of one's sinfulness, combined with the expression of one's need for God's grace. Eventually, he also rejected, not immediately, the need for absolution by a confessor. In the aftermath of the Council of Trent in the 16th century, confession was normally practiced in a semi-open confessional box where both the penitent and the priest could be seen in the church but not heard. This was meant to protect both penitent and priest from any accusation of impropriety in the use of the sacrament. The Second Vatican Council in the 20th century re-emphasized the function of the sacrament as an act of reconciliation with God and with the Church and with others from whom one may have been estranged. Communal penance services were introduced once again, although I suspect they are more honored in principle than in practice here in the United States. In the last few centuries, the seal of confession, a natural derivate of the individualization of sacramental reconciliation or penance, has become more seriously emphasized. A priest who breaks the seal not only sinned seriously, but is automatically excommunicated. Absolution from that excommunication is reserved to the Pope. The same is true of a priest who would solicit sexual favors or other serious sin in such a setting. Even when absolved of such a crime, as opposed to a sin, such a priest might well be prevented from engaging in sacramental ministry ever again. As a priest without that much parish experience over the years, I'm mainly an academic, I would say that the most powerful experience I have ever had of administering the sacrament of reconciliation took place on death row in an African prison about 25 years ago. A man's hanging, as Samuel Johnson once said, concentrates his mind wonderfully. I hope that man about to be hanged 25 years ago, whose confession I was privileged to hear with my head pressed against the bars of his crowded cell while he whispered into my ear, is interceding now with God for a sinner like me. Alan Shatter, the Fine Gael Minister for Justice in the present Irish government, 2 years ago called for a suspension of the secret of confession in Ireland, as did Francis Fitzgerald, the Fine Gael Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, at least when the matter confessed was deemed to be sexual abuse of minors. Shatter, a lawyer, and Fitzgerald are both married people. They did not at the same time call for the suspension of lawyer-client privilege or the exemption of a spouse from having to testify against his or her marriage partner, even though in the latter case, one marriage partner may well know a great deal about the sexual abuse of a child by the other marriage partner. They're calling for one sort of suspension of confidentiality, and not the other two, raises some questions. Much more could be said on this topic, but I will stop here. I want to add one other issue. In the state of Oklahoma, Sharia law has been made illegal. I presume that means that a Muslim marriage cannot be performed legally in the state of Oklahoma. A Catholic marriage, a Protestant marriage, a Jewish marriage can be performed in most states of the Union because the state recognizes you have to fill out forms and be registered as a minister of matrimony, but not in the state of Oklahoma. This is unequal before the law.
Thanks very much.